We're excited today to welcome both Sean Lawler and Tracy Grabowski with OmniPress to take us through the webinar today, which is surprisingly simple tips to ensure you're sourcing high-quality original conference content. And I'm going to let them tell you all about that. But first about Tracy. Tracy has spent the past 20 years leading strategic marketing efforts for organizations in both the profit and nonprofit industries. She has also spent the past 10 years serving on board of her local chapter of the American Marketing Association, bringing to the table firsthand knowledge of challenges to many associations, things that they face when it comes to collecting, distributing, and leveraging their content. She has most recently donned her conference planner hat and currently leads the planning of the chapter's largest source of non-dues revenues at their annual conference. Sean has over 15 years of experience in the web and application development industry, which has included developing learning management systems, content management systems, and doing web consulting. He's been working with associations for 8 years and currently leads the evolution of OmniPress digital products, developing unique solutions and industry best practices that help streamline and simplify the collection and delivery of high-quality program content. Sean is also an active member of ACGI. So without further delay, I'd like to hand over the controls to both Sean and Tracy and welcome you both. How are you both doing today?
We're great. Thank you, Arj. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. All right. So again, my name is Tracy Grabowski, Director of Marketing here at OmniPress. I'm going to lead off, just kind of get us started, and then we'll hand it off to my colleague, Sean, who will be really taking us through today's topic in depth. I'd also like to mention we've uploaded some support materials in the handouts portion of the GoToWebinar tool. So there you'll find one of our most popular white papers on some things you need to think about when you're selecting an abstract management system, as well as our State of the Conference Industry report that we're actually going to reference just a little bit of in here. Some really interesting insights there. So first I want to say we're very excited to see so much interest in today's webinar, although it's not at all surprising because we do talk to association executives, conference planners, and program chairs such as yourselves every day and consistently hear the same challenges over and over again when it comes to managing a collection and review process for conferences. So we're here today to provide you with some very simple steps you can start taking today to simplify your next call for papers, abstracts, and speakers, while at the same time ensuring the quality, integrity, and originality of that content. I do want to clarify that throughout today's presentation, you'll hear us interchange terminology such as abstract management, call for papers, or speaker management. The tips we're going to give you today really apply to any process where you're soliciting data and content from your industry or from your members, vetting through those submissions, and ultimately selecting the best submissions for a presentation at your conference. Again, I just want to reiterate what Arj said. We'll be leaving time for Q&A at the very end. So as we go, if you have questions, feel free to submit them through your GoToWebinar tool. Just a quick sample shown here, in case those of you might not be familiar with GoToWebinar. We do absolutely want to hear your questions. Before we jump in, again, a little bit of housekeeping on our end too. I just want to give you a little bit of information about OmniPress so that for those of you that might not be familiar with us, know where our perspective and where our knowledge comes from. We were founded 40 years ago as a printer, as our name suggests, specifically helping associations collect and produce printed proceedings for conferences, which was pretty much the only option for conference content at that time. Surprisingly, not many printers across the country were equipped to handle the specialized requirements of conference proceedings, from the work involved to collate and format very disparate content coming from multiple sources, to printing and shipping under incredibly tight timelines. Today, of course, the content landscape is significantly different thanks to technology, and we've evolved our offerings and expertise accordingly. We're currently working with over 500 associations each year to collect, produce, and distribute both their print and digital content. So our portfolio of products and services today includes an online abstract management system, a digital publishing platform for getting conference content online in an easily searchable way, an event app, and then what we call digital hard goods, which are USBs, DVDs, CDs, as well as our traditional conference printing services. So throughout our 40-year history, we've served nearly 30,000 conferences, which means we've collected a large volume of best practices based on our own experiences working with our customers and direct observations of what folks intend to happen and what actually happens before, during, and after a conference. So that's a bit about us. Let's begin our discussion today by discussing why it's so important that your conference feature the highest quality, original, and thought-provoking content from your industry leaders. In early 2016, we conducted a survey of 151 association executives and conference planners to understand whether they're seeing a shift in how they are or how they plan to deliver educational content in order to meet the needs of both current and future attendees, and what challenges this presents to them. Just as a side note, we are currently working on our 2017 report, so watch for that to come out in early January. So not surprisingly, from this, we learned that planners understand that the primary role of their organization's annual conference, which also happens to be the largest source of non-dues revenue for many associations, is to deliver knowledge to its members. We further learned through this that each year, an increasing number of organizations are choosing to offer a mix of both print and digital materials at their conferences. In fact, associations indicated that they are typically using at least 2 different methods of content delivery for a single conference. The technology isn't just more prevalent among attendees at the conference, however. Organizers also leverage technology to help simplify common tasks in putting that conference together. Abstract and speaker management is one such tool that continues to evolve, replacing what was once a very manual process using email and spreadsheets. Yet, as you can see here, managing the collection and review process is still by far the single most challenging aspect of managing and distributing conference content. So although tools such as an online abstract management system are being more widely used, what we've learned here is that technology by itself isn't really adding much value. So my colleague Sean Lawler is now going to walk us through why this is such a challenging process and share some really simple tips for how to set up and run a collection process that minimizes these challenges.
Thank you, Tracy. Let's get interactive and start by taking a quick poll of our audience. So if we could get that poll up, please. If you want to expand that window for me so I can see some results. So the question is, do you currently use an external web-based abstract management system to collect and manage your conference content? We'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. I was incorrect, Melissa. I can't see that. So if you could let us know what the results were, please.
All right. Let me see. So a couple more people that are filling it out. All right. I'll go ahead and close that. And looks like we have 83% said yes, 17% said no.
Oh, that's interesting. So those people that said no, I'd be curious if you're collecting more than 30 submissions, because I typically tell people that are collecting more than 30 submissions that you should really get away from email and spreadsheets, because it just becomes really inefficient and you have problems with version control after that point. So for those of you that in the 80+% that are leveraging technology, such as an online abstract management system, know that it does definitely help stream certain processes. You don't need to have to manually track the status of submissions or send out individual emails to each submitter, for example. But as you can see from this list that we have on this slide, technology alone will only get you so far. The reason for our webinar today is that you really have to have the right processes in place, not just the right tools. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So from our own experiences setting up collection sites for our customers and watching how submitters, reviewers, and administrators actually use them, we've identified 10 of the most common challenges that folks experience and how to avoid them by making simple changes to your process. So here is tip 1. First tip, start with the end in mind. Don't map out your collection system fields based only on what you need someone to fill out to complete a submission. You really want to ask yourself, where is all of this data eventually going to reside? I know it can be hard when all you're thinking about is getting your call up and running, but to be really successful, you must determine where your content is going to go before you start to invite people to contribute materials for your conference. So you have an accurate accounting of all the data you'll eventually need to have for your program book, mobile app, or website, wherever that's going. For example, we have one client that develops a published book of all accepted papers, which features significantly more author data than they need to complete initial submission. Prior to working with us, they didn't collect that additional data until authors were accepted, which ended up taking much more time on the back end. Trying to match that data that was collected through the system with data collected through other methods, like email typically, is extremely difficult because the data doesn't always conform. It doesn't match up. Authors may, for instance, submit their own name differently each subsequent time, such as John versus Jonathan or Johnny, which means data synchronizing becomes a manual process. Or if you decide to use your abstract management system to collect that additional data later, it can be challenging to get a submitter to return to your system again. So save yourself a tremendous amount of hassle and collect all data you'll eventually need right at the beginning, so you're not hunting it down at the last minute. In summary, in order to effectively collect and then migrate your data to different outputs, as we see here, you need to reverse engineer the data requirements of those different attendee-facing materials. So bonus tip, hooray, you should also be thinking about any information you need for any type of reports or any other reasons not related to the educational content. For example, combining nominations for awards or grant applications into the collection process has become very popular over the last few years. Collecting copyright releases, disclosures, and CE or CME information has also become much more common. You may also want to gather additional data from your submitters to update membership records, run specific reports that will be helpful for your team or committees, and assist other vendors like your audiovisual company. Finally, you might want to reflect on your last conference's data, like review scores and session surveys, to determine who you might want to proactively invite to your next event. And now that you know what information you need to gather, let's talk about planning when your collection process will occur. So tip number 2 involves taking a hard look at your timeline from the moment you begin putting your collection process together to the day of your conference. You need to determine what your true deadlines are before you begin, and we recommend shifting them ahead by days or even weeks in case of unanticipated delays, and expect that people, especially your submitters, are going to miss deadlines. So consider displaying an advertised deadline that's, as I said, days to weeks ahead of your true submission deadline. I can think of one customer that only has their call for abstracts open for 1 week, and they do not accept any late submissions, and they have a 99% compliance rate. They're definitely an exception, and most of our customers do not have that luxury. So pad those dates, because we found 80% or more of your submissions will come in during the last 72 hours of your submission window, whenever that advertised deadline might be. And you're likely to still have late submitters that you're going to be chasing down after that. That's just very typical. So you can't change the date of your conference. So again, giving your deadline some cushion is going to allow you to accept late content without affecting the delivery of the material to your event. This is also going to give you the chance to make any necessary revisions without the additional pressure of a looming deadline, data transfer issues, or rush charges from your vendors. One important item you should really be sure to build into your timeline is system testing before it opens, which is a great segue here. So tip 3, testing. Before we jump in, we have another poll, Melissa. The question is, do you thoroughly test your site before you open it up to your submitters? So we'll give you a few seconds, and if we could get the results, Melissa, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. right, looks like almost everybody's taken it, so. All right, so we have 75% said yes, 25% said no.
Okay, 25%. Please think of this when you set up a collection site that it's very similar to launching a website. It's very important to carefully test the functionality so you can minimize the possibility that data is filled in and submitted incorrectly, and to make sure you didn't forget any important data. That's probably the thing you really want to concentrate on. In particular, you'd like to pay attention to making sure that all conditional logic's working the way it should, assuming that you have some. Because changing that after submissions start coming in is very difficult to do. And really, no matter how well you try and anticipate, someone always manages to use the system in a way that you wouldn't have guessed. One of my previous positions was a quality control tester, and I would intentionally try to break things. Your customers might not be thinking the same way, your user base, but they will do it regardless. So if you can, recruit testers that represent a wide variety of ages and technical skills, and don't be afraid to engage people outside of your organization, specifically those that have absolutely no familiarity with the system or even really what a paper submission process is, period. If they can figure out exactly what they need to do and in which order they need to do it, you can feel confident that your process is going to run smoothly. And even if you have one of the most basic or streamlined processes possible, most of your contributors aren't working in the system until the very last minute. So it's not uncommon for people to panic. And that's where having technical support comes in very handily. So tip 4, it's all about making sure your users are taken care of and can complete their required tasks with a minimum amount of stress. Ideally, you'll have technical support resources available to your submitters because, as I mentioned, most of them will be accessing your system at the last minute, after hours, and they'll be rushed and unlikely to read the instructions carefully, not that they typically read them in the first place. There's a few different ways you can provide the support. The more methods you incorporate, the more likely it is that your users are going to have a pleasant experience. The first is to have an area where users can answer the questions themselves via a self-help area like an FAQ or maybe Zendesk or Freshdesk solution or software. However, your users might also need live support. So make sure you or your vendor are available around the deadline to answer calls, emails, or chat messages. And this is why we recommend your deadlines, whether they're advertised or real, take place in the middle of the day based on the time zone of the majority of your user base and early in the week so your technical support personnel can answer questions immediately because no one wants to take calls at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. Finally, it's helpful if you can offer your submitters the option to choose whether they are asking a technical question or a non-technical question, such as, if I'm accepted, can you make sure my session's on Wednesday because otherwise I'm not going to be able to attend. You may want technical questions to be serviced by your vendor, while the non-technical questions go directly to your team. Be prepared to have most of your technical support questions come in during those last 72 hours while people are rushing to submit before the deadline, as many users have simply forgotten their password or username. About 90% of our technical support requests involve a forgotten username or password, and that's really typical for any login-based system. So let's move on to tip 5 now. This may be obvious, but you're going to want to gather your data in the smallest pieces you can. This can be very helpful when you're moving information to a different destination, such as your AMS, your mobile app, or a program book, as it gives you a lot more flexibility when it comes time to format your submissions for specific conference materials, and it reduces or even eliminates the need to manually separate out fields. Getting as granular as you can with your fields also increases the likelihood that all submitters are going to fill in that data correctly and consistently, and decreases the need for data cleanup later on. For instance, even if you're not going to publish credentials anywhere, you'll want to include a field for submitters to fill in if, for no other reason, that they're sure that they don't, for no other reason than to be sure they don't enter that information wherever they think they can fit it in, which may be in the first name field or the last name field, for instance. If you give them a designated space for it, your data will be correct and clean when you pull it out of your system. Once you've collected all necessary data, you may want to make sure that you're vetting your submissions before you send them to reviewers. In tip 6, you want to think about taking a second look at the submissions before the review phase starts, which is also something you want to account for in your timeline. You may be able to quickly determine that a submission will not make the cut because the user hasn't given copyright releases or disclosures or paid a submission fee. You'll also want to plan for time to perform a plagiarism check. There are a variety of both free and paid tools to help you with this. Some organizations with more stringent publishing policies have actually mandated that all of their abstract and paper management systems integrate with industry-leading plagiarism checking software to really ensure that content integrity is upheld, which may be something you want to consider. IEEE is doing that, for example, in 2017. Once the submissions pass through an initial checkpoint, it's time to enlist the help of your reviewers. One question we often get for customers is, how many reviewers is ideal? Every conference has unique requirements, so there's no one-size-fits-all answer, but there are definitely some common practices to consider. Try to avoid assigning every submission a unique reviewer. When this happens, each reviewer ends up only being responsible for a handful of abstracts. This means your reviewers aren't as proficient in the process, and they don't have as deep a perspective on overall submission quality, and they require significantly more technical assistance. Consider keeping your reviewer pool to a certain percentage of submissions, of around 10%. So if you have 100 papers, you should have 10 reviewers. This allows the reviewers to become more accountable for their feedback and gives them a chance to become proficient in the process. Plan to recruit more reviewers than you'll actually need, though, as inevitably, some will drop out or become unresponsive during the process. Also make sure you allow your reviewers a chance to return to the system and make changes later. Oftentimes we see that reviewers tend to err on the side of the more conservative or generous side. They don't get a good sense of the relative quality of submissions until they've seen everything that they've been assigned to. And at that point, they may want to go back into the system and adjust some of their earlier scores. Speaking of review, let's talk about the timing of your review process in tip 8. It usually isn't a good idea to have submissions and reviews happening simultaneously, or what we call a rolling review. Since most of your submitters are going to wait to submit until the deadline, it's not worth the headache to invite reviewers in to give their feedback on a handful of documents when they'll have to come back later and potentially review those same submissions all over again because something has since been revised. Reporting also becomes difficult when you have both review assignments and submissions constantly changing. Finally, it's harder to get people to come back and give you feedback or modify their submission a second time. As your requests to return to the system increase, you're going to have less compliance. You'll probably get less grief from your reviewers too if you don't have to constantly invite them back into the system to edit previously completed work. One of the most frustrating parts of a submission and review process actually happens after that submission and review process is over. It's the period of time between your speakers or papers have been accepted for the conference and you're now managing the production of that content for the conference. We call this the data gap. It's highly likely that from the time your collection site closes to the time you're providing final files to a print or digital vendor for conference materials, the content will change multiple times. Co-authors are added, citations are changed, and so forth. Typically, this happens after the content's already been pulled out of your site at least once, which means most of the current data is no longer in your abstract management system, it's moved on. And if you're providing content to multiple vendors, it makes the task of managing and tracking updates extremely difficult. Many customers have come to us to manage their submission processes because they were using email and Excel amongst their committees and having a real hard time maintaining version control and accurate data. We recommend that you set up some database of record that's a centralized location of all content updates and use this to provide files to all of your production vendors. It's even more helpful if you can assign one person to manage and track all changes. So now you've compiled all of your data in a single location. You're going to need to consider how your attendees would like to experience it. So last but not certainly least, It can be easy to assume that younger attendees only want to consume conference materials digitally, or that a program book is no longer necessary because you have an event app. Each medium, from a content website to printed materials to an event app, has its own unique value and is used in different ways at different points during the conference. Be sure you're providing attendees with the right mix of options based on stated preferences and past usage data. In fact, even consider giving a survey to your membership to see what they prefer. If you'd like an interactive features or access to handouts and schedule, but you don't have Wi-Fi at your event, an app's a great delivery mechanism. But just keep in mind, without Wi-Fi, you'll want to be sure that users download the app prior to the meeting so they're not frustrated with an inability to access it when they arrive. And the shelf life of an app tends to be shorter, so keep that in mind if you want attendees to access the content after the event. If you do have Wi-Fi, a website dedicated to the conference content's a nice option. Basically, it can provide easy access to content on site with built-in note-taking capabilities, and attendees can easily access and search for content they did not see firsthand based on keyword, topic, or author, for example. Websites are also great for building an archived library of past and future conference content, as well as marketing your conference and your association to future members and attendees. Make sure it's responsibly designed so users with mobile devices can view it properly. And don't forget print. You may want to send out an advanced program for marketing purposes and then have a book of abstracts or proceedings or even a mini guide available when attendees arrive at your registration desk. And if at all possible, as I said, send out a survey to your membership or request how your registrants would prefer to consume the event content during your registration process. These 10 tips reflect some of the guidance we provide to new customers who've run into challenges in the past and are now starting to work with us for their abstract management. If you start by implementing even a few of these before you open your next call for papers or speakers, you'll simplify the process for yourself and for your staff while also keeping program quality and integrity intact. It's definitely a win-win. And this concludes our portion of the presentation. We'd like to move into the Q&A portion by addressing questions we've gathered during the presentation. Thanks for helping us with that, Melissa.
Yeah, no problem.
Great presentation, Sean and Tracy. Fantastic information. And we do have some questions coming up here. If it's okay, I'm going to jump right into them. First question says, how far out should I plan to open my collection site?
Okay. Well, how soon you open should be dependent on that it gives you enough time to collect the appropriate amount of submissions, thoroughly review them, plan your program, and get your material to wherever it's going, your appropriate vendors. But you should always work backwards from that last deadline to make sure you have enough time. That being said, we tell people don't be in a rush to open your site without being sure you'll be collecting everything you need, as we spoke of earlier. Simply advertising the month that you open can be good enough. And as I mentioned, the vast majority of your submissions are going to come in during the final hours that your site's open anyways. So again, it's really the deadline you should be concerned with, not necessarily the time that you open. Just make sure that you get the word out that you are opening at some point. Do you have anything to add, Tracy? Or
no, that's about it. I think Sean's point about when you're advertising it, making sure that you stick to advertising the approximate month that it is going to be open so folks know about when to look for it. And that way you're not tying yourself down to a date, because oftentimes what does happen, and it depends on how many stakeholders have to be involved in the process, there can be delays in getting your site set up. And so that allows you to account for that. So that, again, you can make sure that everything is running properly and you do have the time to test the site before anything has to be open. If you remember, as Sean mentioned earlier, we do actually have a customer that only really has their site open for 1 week. Yeah. So it's really up to what you know about your membership and your submitters, how complex the information is that they need to submit. Sometimes submitters like the opportunity to be able to go in early to get things started, but then we'll come back again and again and again to edit and refine before they hit that final submit button. So I guess if your content is fairly straightforward, you don't necessarily have to have it open very long, maybe a few weeks. If it's more complex, more scientific, more research-based, you might want to give your submitters a few months to really work through that process and finalize their abstracts or their papers.
Great. You know, testing is important to any system that gets implemented, just like ACGI's, and I'm sure OmniPress as well. But next question says, how far in advance of opening my site should I plan on testing?
I'd say at least a couple weeks, probably. Another thing you really want to make sure, and not everybody does this, unfortunately, is when you're putting your test submissions in, also see how they're coming out. Go ahead and test that your reports are running appropriately. Make sure that you're able, if your system has a messaging system, that messages are going out with all the right data included. Again, testing is key. While it's not difficult to do necessarily to change the system midstream, it does often involve having people come back to the system, and as we said, the more touches you have, the less likely people are actually going to follow them. So in order to get that high quality content, you want to make sure that everything's good to go at the time you launch, which goes back to it actually relates to the previous question, to make sure that you're planning the appropriate time and getting in there and making sure that everything looks good before you open. Just advertise the month. Don't hold yourself to that. I've always opened it on December 15th, therefore I have to do that this year. Keep them guessing.
Mm-hmm. I'd say the biggest thing too is make sure you're leaving enough time that you can ask a few different people in a few different mm-hmm. roles to spend a little bit of time with it. Sometimes we find it's even helpful to take out the instructions altogether and see how far they get without the actual written instructions. And then make sure too that that's leaving you enough time to make any adjustments, so that, you know, again, you can make sure that your submitters and your reviewers have the best experience possible, especially because that experience really does reflect on your conference. That is another touch point with some key people that are going to be at your conference, and that is, you know, think of your abstract management system as their first impression with your conference and possibly even with your organization.
Yeah, it's part of your brand.
Okay, very good. And next question we got is, do you have any guidelines on writing instructions, how long or how short to make them?
Okay, yeah, I actually wrote a blog post on this not too long ago, which should have been titled "People Don't Read." So that being said, yeah, it's ours. You know this quite well, I'm sure. So yeah, nobody reads anything, which is a shame.
I'm one of those people who don't read.
You're part of the problem.
Yeah.
So the first thing really is to know who your audience is, and make sure that you're using language in terms that they understand. I mean, if it's a scientific conference, be using obviously the potential scientific terms of that industry. As far as short or long, keep them as short and concise as possible. Don't say something in 30 words that you could say in 7. Also, things to think about is if you have sequential instructions, use a numbered list. If they're optional, doesn't really matter what order they're in, use bulleted list. And another thing that you can do, I would assume in most systems, is that call attention to instructions that are really important. Maybe make them bold, maybe make them red. But don't overdo that. Obviously, you're kind of crying wolf throughout the form if you do that. But those ones that are very important, make sure that you do that. Also, make sure that you have instructions which are hopefully baked into the system that let people know, no, you're not done yet. You have not completed something. Please go back and fill this in because this is required. I need it in order to have everything to move forward to the conference.
With organizations we work with too, there's quite a few where they may have submitters where English is not necessarily mm-hmm. their first or primary language. So you have to make sure that they can be understood and possibly even paired with visual cues throughout the system as well, so that for those where English is not their first language, they can still get through the system as easily as possible.
Great suggestions there, and certainly note to self, I will read instructions more carefully.
Oh,
but
thank you.
They have to be easy, right? They have to be easy to understand. Got a question. You said not to assign a single submission to a single reviewer. What is a good number of reviewers per submission?
Okay. Yeah, so typically we usually see 2 or 3. 3 is a great number because it means that if 2 people, I mean, you're unlikely to have the same score from everybody, so you'll see a better averaging. That's usually what we see is that amount. However, you may decide that depending on what particular topics, topics, categories, tracks, subjects that you have, that certain people might be overloaded because it's a very popular topic at your conference, and then other ones might be somewhat of a desert as far as content contribution. So you may have to go in after you set up these automatic rules and said, okay, this group gets 3 submissions per reviewer, to go in and tweak that slightly depending on, again, the popularity of the topic.
Okay, great. Next question that comes in that says, can the submission process be standardized by using templates for submitters to use for abstracts so the information is consistent when used in the final program?
Okay, that's a great question. So if that's something that you need to do, what we typically see is that people will break the abstract out into multiple parts, preferably doing it via plain text, because then once that raw data comes out of the system, you can format that based on whatever rules you decide with your vendor, however you see fit. So instead of having a large block of text, consider breaking it out for formatting purposes. And while most systems will have the ability to do rich text, we don't necessarily think that that's, if you're only collecting it one way, that's the way to do it. What I often suggest is maybe get a little excessive and say, I'd like your abstract in plain text, I'd like your abstract, and obviously broken out again, I'd like your abstract as rich text, and I'd like your abstract uploaded as, you know, a PDF with fonts embedded. So wherever this is finally going, depending on if I want to use my rules or make things pixel perfect, depending on what they're doing, I have a bunch of different variants of it that I can pick and choose from when I'm moving it to a final output.
Great. Great questions coming in. And I'd just like to remind everyone that you still have some time here to ask some questions in the GoToMeeting console. Just go into the question box and just send us any questions you may have. For right now, we have one more question in the queue here. And it says, I've learned over time that I've learned over time that I have a pretty unique and complex process which has tripped up previous vendors mid-process. Do you have some specific questions I should ask a potential vendor to make sure things run more smoothly in the future?
Okay, so that's kind of the, is it you or is it me? Before you speak with your vendor, think about, are you doing something in your process that really needs to be that complicated? Maybe you inherited some sort of legacy process that really doesn't follow best practices, but you've always done it that way. So rethink that. I mean, pay very close attention to that. Maybe throw it to some people that are unfamiliar with it and say, does this really make sense? And is it getting you where you need to go in an overly complex manner? So talk to your vendor, because they're obviously experts. They've been doing this a long time, and they can look at what you're doing and give you some advice so you can tweak things so they're not so cumbersome. And I do like to tell people that we are more than willing to be your scapegoat for any changes to your process. So just blame us. Say, hey, I'm moving into a new system. You know, OmniPress forced us to change things this way. Blame them. But at the end of the day, you're going to have a smoother process, and things are just going to go more swimmingly.
I will say, too, that a lot of times, rather than starting the conversation with exactly what the process needs to be, start the question with, where is it that you're trying to get? What are you trying to achieve? What is your end goal or your end objective?
Yep.
And your vendor should be able to then be able to take that information and map out a process that potentially works better than what you're doing today, but still gets you to exactly where you need to go.
And they're more familiar with the tools itself, too. So they might have some interesting workarounds that you wouldn't have thought of because, again, you're saying, do it this way instead of this is my ultimate goal.
Well, great. We have another question that just came in, and thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We still have some time here, so please, if you have any last-minute questions, please submit them in the question box in your GoToMeeting console. The next question is, what is the best method of moving information to a mobile app, especially when we have speaker name additions and title changes? Oh, that happens all the time. All the time it happens, all the way up to the days of the conference. So what do you do in that case?
Yeah, that's great. Well, there's kind of two ways you can do it. If your system has an API to the mobile vendor, regardless of who they might be, you can essentially be making changes and publish them directly to the app. Oftentimes, it might take maybe upwards of a half an hour for those changes to appear, but that might be the most efficient way to do it because it's relatively hands-off. However, going back to the database of record things, once things have moved on from the abstract management system, you might determine that just within the mobile app administration area that you're just making your changes there. And many apps have the ability to be making those changes on your mobile device, which is pretty cool. So you might be able to just simply open your phone and start making changes there appropriately. Now, that being said, you want that data to be archived somewhere. So either being able to get an export out of the mobile app to push back in your abstract management system if you don't have that real-time web services API might be important to you. Otherwise, you're just going to want to archive that locally to make sure that you have that data moving forward, especially if you're moving into other places that need to have those changes reflected, like your website needs to get updated post-conference because you've got late papers, someone didn't show up, you have those title changes and whatnot.
Good. I think that concludes all the questions that we've gotten. I don't see any more coming in right now. But I would like to thank all of our participants today who have kindly sent us those questions and for staying on the webinar for as long as you have. Appreciate it. I'd like to thank you, Sean and Tracy from Omni Press for joining us today and just a very impressive presentation. Do you have any final words, or is there anything else other than how to reach you, which we have here up on the screen? Is there anything else that you'd like to say to the audience?
Just thank you all for attending. Hopefully we have given you a few things to think about that takes some of the pain out of your next call for papers or presentations. And if at any time you have any questions about how might I approach this, should I do this? I mean, obviously, even if you're not directly working with us, we've been doing this for a long time, and we've seen a lot of what happens out there. Yeah, out there, what happens in the real world. So we're more than happy to share our experiences and the experiences of some of our clients anytime.
Yeah, thank you, Arch. Thank you, Melissa, so much for having us.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's our pleasure to have you, and I also have Omni Press as an ACGI resource partner. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today, all of our customers, prospects, and everyone else in the association and credentialing world. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope to catch you soon at one of our other webinars. And thanks again, Tracy and Sean.
Thank you.
Have a good day.